welcome back again to Martyrs, Kings, and Fathers, the first 700 years of Christianity. Today we will be actually looking at the first two ecumenical councils. This is a big deal. These are the two first councils that are held by Christians everywhere. I don't care if it's Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Lutheran, Anglican, Methodist, whatever. These are the first two ecumenical councils. Now, there is a council in the New Testament, so there is some precedence for this, and that's actually found in Acts 15. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the biblical narrative, in Acts 15, Paul and his companions actually show up in Jerusalem to have a council with the leaders of the Jerusalem church, especially James, who was a family member related to Jesus by blood, who actually was in charge of the Jerusalem church. He's called James the Just, or the Bishop of Jerusalem. And so as he's there, Paul comes and they have a council. And at this council, they're actually discussing what to do about Gentiles, non-Jews, who accepted Christ as the Messiah, as the anointed one, the Savior of the world. And so they have a discussion and they decide that Gentiles do not have to keep the law and that they're able to actually become Christians and part of the coming kingdom, so to speak. However, they are told to abstain from food offered to idols, to avoid sexual immorality, and a few other things that are attached to it. The point being that they still have to behave themselves, but that they are welcome to be in the kingdom, and that what Paul is preaching is the gospel. And so they have a council because there was some controversy surrounding how Jewish the Gentiles needed to be once they accepted Christ as the Messiah. And so you can see already that the early church has the scriptures in mind. They have this early apostolic era in mind involving council. So if we have a controversy in the church, we need to solve it by meeting in a council. So first, just as we get into these councils, remember that there is biblical precedence for this, or apostolic precedence, if you want to use that term instead, for the idea of a council. So this first council, the Council of Nicaea in 325, you'll actually hear some people that really know ancient Greek. They'll actually say something like Nicaea or something like that, and it's because there's really not many soft S sounds in the original Greek, but we all say as a good anglicized speakers that it's the Council of Nicaea in 325. But this Nicene Council, many of you may have heard of the Nicene Creed, which has its origins, at least the first version of it, in this council. When we get into this, we need to first review what we mean by Arianism. We actually closed our last episode talking about Arianism, so it would do well for us to just review it just a little bit and understand what the controversy is. So remember, as we had talked about last week, that Arianism starts in 319 AD, and it's associated with a priest or a presbyter or a pastor, depending on how you translate it, in Alexandria named Arius. Now, he was actually a local priest or presbyter under the authority of the Bishop of Alexandria. Now, the name of the Bishop of Alexandria is Alexander, so as I mentioned last time, it's a bit confusing because Alexander of Alexandria is the one that's involved here. But regardless, Alexander of Alexandria gave a sermon to all the different religious leaders, all the different Christian leaders in Alexandria, where he really strongly emphasized the traditional church teachings on the divinity of Christ. Now, this actually troubled Arius, because Arius was very much concerned about the singleness of the Father and the unity of the Godhead, and he went too far. And so in response, Arius gives a sermon where he literally says that there was a time when the Son was not. In other words, Christ, even though he may be supreme and the firstborn, is still a created being. In other words, there was a time, sometime in the great distant past before creation, when God actually created the Son. That's a huge problem when it came to Christology and the person of Christ, and also just Trinitarian doctrine in general, because if it means that Christ is created, that means he's less than the Father. He's not quite fully God. He may be a supreme created creature, but he's still less than God. He's kind of a demigod or a semigod, and so that creates a problem in the church. We can't have that as far as Orthodox Christianity, where Christ is fully God. He and the Father are one, as he says in his Gospels. And so because of this, Alexander disciplines Arius. He at first tries to just check him locally and say, you need to repent of this. You need to get things under control here. You're wrong. You need to respect my authority as your leader, as your overseer, which is what the word bishop means. But instead, Arius actually ups the ante and ends up leaving Alexandria and starts rallying people to his cause, including influential people such as Eusebius of Nicomedia. And there's other sympathizers that we've mentioned before. And so this creates an empire-wide problem. What originally started as just a local problem in Egypt actually transfers itself all the way across the empire and even outside of the empire, as we'll see in a second with the people who attend the council. It becomes that big of a deal. So what initially started as a local discipline problem becomes an empire-wide theological problem. And in this era, you must remember, in this era, the idea of spiritual stability is closely tied into temporal stability or political stability. There's no such thing as separation of church and state. And so Constantine could call himself the bishop of bishops, even though he didn't necessarily act as one, although he did occasionally. At this council, he does not, to his credit. But he could actually make these statements, and nobody questioned it. There was no separation. That whole separation of church and state idea really doesn't start becoming popular until what we would call modernity, so like 1800s. Really, the American experiment and also the French Revolution and some other areas are the first time that we start to really see what we would call secular democratic idealism. And so in this era, it is not uncommon for emperors, for kings, for counts, for dukes, or generals, whoever it may be, it is not uncommon to see them take an interest in theological squabbles. And there's a reason for that, again, because it has to do with stability and because they thought that their mandate to rule was divinely inspired or a divine gift, and that in order to be an effective ruler, they needed to execute their authority for the good of the realm and for the good of Christendom. And so this is a theme that goes all the way up into the early modern era. Things like the Inquisition, for example, have to do with the stability of the realm and people undermining the authority of the church, which was like becoming an enemy of the state. Now, it doesn't mean it was all good or anything, but just you got to understand you can't take secular, egalitarian, democratic idealism and read it into the past and then start judging what happened at the time. You just can't do that because it's really, one, unfair to the past, and it actually says more about you as a secular democratic idealist than it does to the people at the time. It has more to do with the person looking back than it does with the people that actually experienced and did the deeds that we're studying at this moment. So just a warning, don't read these sort of modernistic and even in some cases postmodernistic ideas and read them into the past and try to say that you're going to judge everything, because we're talking about a completely different worldview when it comes to these councils and even just the way emperors and kings and bishops, etc. operate. So as we look at Nicaea, and you can see on your screen here, there's a map of where Nicaea is. The Emperor Constantine, in 325, because he was concerned about the stability of his realm, because he was concerned that this theological dispute was going to be an embarrassment to him, because as you remember, he's a fairly recent convert, but he's trying to make Christianity the favored religion of the realm. Not necessarily official yet, because it's not until the 380s, 370s that it becomes the state religion. But in the 320s, Constantine is still concerned with this, and so it's in a sense an embarrassment when the leaders of the church, the people that are supposed to be the shepherds, the pastors of the people, are having this big squabble and everybody knows about it. In fact, on the streets of the cities, people are getting into arguments and they're singing songs and propaganda wars against each other of whether or not the sun was not or not. It may sound strange to us, but this was a big deal. People were getting into fights over this, and in some cases, fisticuffs. And this would also happen later on, especially in Constantinople, when we get to the Third Council and the Fourth Council and talking about the person of Christ, that people literally were almost physically into it because it was such a big deal to them. It was such a part of their lives. You would go to the market, and people would talk about Nicaea. It's just a different worldview and a different culture than what we experience today. So Nicaea, of course, is really close to Constantinople, and it's an imperial resort. So there's a palace of sorts there, and Constantine calls all the bishops to this council to solve this vexing Arian problem. So what happens at this council? It is attended by over 300 bishops. We don't have an exact amount because there's some disagreement in the historical account. The number that's eventually settled on is 318 because it's actually a reference to some biblical imagery. But there's 300 bishops plus secretaries and elders and deacons and seminarians, people in training, and other people that are attached to the bishops. For example, Alexander himself brings a secretary who is the great Saint Athanasius because he's elderly. He needs help. In some ways, Athanasius becomes his spokesperson. And so Athanasius comes to the council in his mid to early 20s and helps Alexander of Alexandria. See, there even I'm having difficulty with saying that. But he helps Alexander at the Council of Nicaea. The actual total could have been up to about 1,800 people at this council. However, the deacons and the seminarians and the secretaries weren't necessarily voting or having decision-making ability at the council. Now, they were certainly helping with the writing of things and the organization and the speaking and that sort of stuff, but they were not involved with the actual votes. However, there could have been as many as 1,800 people at this council. And this truly is a universal, ecumenical council of the Church Catholic. Remember, Catholic meaning according to the whole or universal, so you'll hear me kind of use those different terms interchangeably. But this is a true ecumenical council. We have bishops, pastors from all over the world of Christendom, including the Roman Empire, but even outside the Roman Empire. So in the Roman Empire itself, we have people from Turkey, from Egypt, from Greece, from Spain, from Austria, from Syria, etc. We even have people from outside the empire in places like Persia, or what is now present-day Armenia, kind of a vague area around the Black and Caspian Seas. We don't know exactly where the guy was from, but we know it's roughly corresponds to today present-day Armenia. So this is even outside the empire. We've got some representatives coming to this great council called by Constantine. So this is a big deal. This is a big deal. Now, the Bishop of Rome, of course, what we now today call the Pope, also sends representatives, although he's not there personally, but he appoints what we now know as legates, so L-E-G-A-T-E-S, legates, to represent him. And I believe he has a couple of priests and a deacon that represent the Pope because he can't be there in person. But they're still there. They're still there, and they're designated with his authority to approve and to vote and that sort of thing. So what's really, really neat about this council is that as they enter the imperial palace, Constantine had paid for their way. He'd given them a sort of royal treatment as they were on the roads. He paid for their hotel rooms. He fed them. He gave them access to the imperial military roads, so it was a quick and easy drive so they could avoid the bandits and the perils that were on the normal, just everyday traveled roads. So he was treating these guys like royalty. And as they showed up at Constantinople, actually I should say Nicaea, right across the sea there from Constantinople, but at Nicaea, as they show up, many of them still bearing the marks of persecution. Many of them were still bearing those marks. So they would actually show up missing limbs. Or there was a guy who actually did not have the use of his hands. There was somebody that was blinded. There was somebody that had bruises all over his body that never fully healed. We could go on and on and on. They actually bore the marks of persecution. They actually went through the persecutions of Diocletian, the great persecution that we talked about last episode, and also Maximian, which is a lesser, more local persecution. But these guys actually bore those marks. They had actually confessed and were faithful to the faith through a time of persecution. So as they show up at the council, the historian Eusebius of Caesarea says it's like it was an army of martyrs showing up at this council. They had descended upon Nicaea to talk about what the actual faith of the scriptures and of the apostles and, of course, of Christ himself was. And so since Constantine spared no expense, it's kind of a neat poetic justice. Because here they are, they're persecuted by the imperial authorities. They're beat up, they're maimed, they're mutilated. In some cases, some were killed. And then just not even a decade later in some cases, here we have Constantine actually bringing these guys in and treating them like they're royalty. It's really a neat shift in history, and as this army of martyrs descends on Nicaea. And so what ends up happening at this council is the Arian position is allowed to be put forth. Now, most likely this is done by Eusebius of Nicomedia. And so everybody knows who's going to speak first. So all the bishops are gathered in the great hall, and Constantine himself comes to preside in state. And what I mean by that is he's wearing his imperial robes, he's dressed in purple, he's got his diadem on. However, just like as if it were a Senate proceeding in Rome or in Constantinople, Constantine himself does not have a vote. So whether or not you think it's because he's deferring to the bishops, or whether or not you think it's because he's following senatorial procedure, either way, Constantine actually does not have a say. Now, he can actually have discussions, and he can help kind of moderate things and kind of try to talk between factions, but he himself does not really have a say other than just kind of offering his advice or just making comments here and there and trying to keep the parties aligned and getting together. In fact, right at the beginning of the council, because he was the emperor and they knew he was kind of in charge in terms of just managing the proceedings, so to speak, he was receiving letter after letter after letter of bishops complaining about other bishops or about something that didn't happen right or about these grievances. And to Constantine's credit, what he does is he just simply ceremoniously just burns all the protests without even looking at them. In other words, guys, focus on the task at hand. Stop bickering amongst yourselves. Let's take care of this. So you can tell Constantine is an effective leader. Remember, he started out as a very, very popular general, and by this point, he's been emperor for a while, so he knows how to manage a government. He knows how to manage people. He's a good judge of people. That's one thing that you'll have about universal about Constantine is he knows people and knows how to be an effective, charismatic leader. And so what does he do with all these basically bickering protests? Is he just burns them and says, all right, now let's actually talk about what we need to talk about. Kind of a neat moment. In fact, when he actually entered the chamber, as he walked in, he actually walked very quickly and refused to be seated until the bishops were first seated. So symbolically, remember, ceremony and actions and how you do things are very, very important in the ancient world. Whether you bow a certain way, which direction you walk, when you face forward, when you face backward, all of those things actually have symbolic meaning. And so by Constantine refusing to be seated, remember, usually you wouldn't seat until the emperor or the head of the household even was seated. You would not actually yourself sit down. Constantine, deferring to the bishop's authority, actually waits to sit. He waits until the bishops themselves sit down. Kind of a neat moment showing that he honored the authority of the church. So since Arius at this council is really only just a priest, just a local kind of a junior pastor, he doesn't have a whole lot of authority. He's more of just the origin of the teaching. He actually has his friend, his supporter, and in some ways his partisan, Eusebius of Nicomedia, make the presentation for the Arian case. And it's interesting to read because it seems like the Arians were really, really confident, almost cocky, that they were just going to be approved by the church, that if we just present our case, there's not going to be a problem. They're going to hear out how reasonable we are and how we're just confessing the faith that's always been handed down, and there will not be a problem. It's really interesting. If you read the actual proceedings of the council, or at least the records that we do have, we don't have an actual list of proceedings, but we do have records and eyewitness accounts. But if you read them, it's really interesting to see how cocky and self-confident these guys were presenting at the council. Well, Eusebius presents this case, and because he is basically making that statement that there was a time that the sun was not, he is immediately opposed by Alexander and, of course, through Athanasius, his young protege. So Alexander opposes it, and then Athanasius, as a spokesperson, says absolutely not. And of course, that's exactly what happened in Egypt also. So basically what ends up happening at the council is a replay of what had happened in Alexandria, and now the Church Universal, the Church Catholic, the Church Ecumenical, is going to be able to solve this. And so since the Arians had assumed that this simple presentation was going to just persuade everyone, they were absolutely shocked and unprepared for the actual response. What really ends up happening is that the bishops nearly riot. There is just an uproar. People are angry. They are aghast. They are shocked at this idea that Christ is created somehow, that the Son has, somewhere in his history, a time when he didn't exist. This creates a huge controversy in the church. In fact, one of the most famous saints in all of the Christian history, a guy named St. Nicholas, and yes, it is the St. Nicholas, the one that we now know as Santa Claus, which is rather unfortunate in some ways because the real St. Nicholas is a really interesting guy to study in terms of church history and in terms of being a pastor and a bishop. But St. Nicholas is so outraged and so offended that Arius and Eusebius of Nicomedia would profane the Lord that he literally walks up in the presence of all the other bishops and of the Emperor Constantine himself and slaps Arius across the face. Jolly old St. Nick, right? Who walks up and slaps Arius across the face. Now, of course, the bishops, knowing that this isn't good behavior, it's beneath the dignity of the office, and because the emperor is present and a variety of other reasons, they actually arrest St. Nicholas. There's actually an imperial guard, of course, they arrest him and put him in jail overnight because they have to discipline him for acting out and actually physically assaulting somebody. But that shows you something about the character of Nicholas, is that he was so angry and so defensive of the dignity and honor of his Lord that he was willing to go out in front of the council and risk his office, and in some ways risk his life, to make a statement saying, Arius, you're a fool, or Arius, you're basically outside the faith. It's kind of a neat story. So, and of course what ends up happening, especially in the Eastern Church, is they stress the tradition that after he woke up, after in the night. After waking up, he has a dream. After waking up, he has a copy of the Gospels in his hand and some of the vestments of the bishop's office. In other words, it's the divine stamp of approval that he did what he was supposed to do and that he should still be a bishop. And in fact, they don't remove him for office. They think the punishment's enough. He's still allowed to be a bishop, and he's still allowed to have a vote on the council. But it's kind of an interesting episode, and it's just a microcosm of how, not necessarily violent, but how angry and how offended and how shocked the vast majority of pastors and bishops were when they actually listened to and heard this profanation of the divine name of Christ, basically, from the Arians. And so the church then, after hearing this and just absolutely being shocked, decides that Arianism is worse than any of them had ever thought. They had heard rumors. Remember, this is before internet and before documentation and footnotes and everything else. And so because they only had heard rumors or, telephone games, the game of telephone passing things along, they weren't exactly sure how much about Arianism they actually knew. But now that they had heard it straight from the horse's mouth, to use the colloquialism, as they heard it straight from the horse's mouth, they realized that this problem was even greater than they originally thought. And so they decide that in order to combat this heresy, we needed, as a church, to have a statement of faith or a creed to solve this issue. In other words, this was something that all Christians everywhere should confess that would exclude this Arian heresy. And so they decide to craft this official statement of faith. So they actually delegate a committee of sorts to actually draw up this statement. And it's actually based, most likely, on an old Palestinian or Syrian creed. Caesarea is actually the region that we're talking about here, from Eusebius. Eusebius of Caesarea is the famous historian that we talked about in the last episode. He's at the council, and he's actually an Arian sympathizer at first, but by proposing this creed and by going along with the program and realizing that he could be corrected, he actually kind of redeems himself. But that's actually one of the reasons, because he's a little confused on this issue, at least initially, that he is not Saint Eusebius of Caesarea. He's not called a saint. He's just Eusebius the historian. Still enormously important, still considered a church father, but because he was confused, especially early on in this controversy, he's kind of people are wary to just say, oh, he's just great on everything that he does. But regardless, he proposes, or at least sets forward a creed that he was familiar with, and then the local committee at the Council of Nicaea begins to adopt this creed. And so in order to resolve the controversy, the presider of the Western bishops, Hosius of Cordoba, and Cordoba is in Spain, so again, you're seeing how universal this is, who is also the theological advisor to Constantine, has Constantine himself propose a word called homoousia in Greek. This means one substance, or a single substance. This word, this homoousia word, had a lot of philosophical connotations, and this would create a lot of problems for the next few decades in the church. But the idea is that Christ and the Father, even though they are separate personalities, still share the same essence or substance in the Godhead. That there's still one God, which means Christ is not a created being. He has always been begotten from the Father. To think of it this way, if Christ is a created being, that means there was a time when the Father was not Father. Because if he was not actually begetting his Son, he was not a father at that time. And so if the Father is eternal, that has to mean that the Son is eternal. Otherwise, the Father was for a time not the Father. So there's some inherent logic to this. And so basically they argue, and I would argue rightfully so here, as you can tell, that the Nicene Creed is going to, with this word, homoousia, exclude this Arian heresy that basically had a lesser Jesus. It was a wrong Jesus, because the Jesus they believed in was a created being. If you believe in a created Jesus, a Jesus who has not always existed, and this is for those of you out here right now, if you believe in a created Jesus, it is not the Jesus of Christianity. Because the Jesus of Christianity has always existed before all time, was present at creation, and even before creation has always been begotten of the Father. Hence in the Nicene Creed, begotten of his Father, before all worlds, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, as the Creed says. And those of us who are in more traditional churches are very familiar with. It excludes Arianism. The original Creed, in fact, even has anathemas at the end of it, saying that those who say things like, there was a time the Son was not, are actually anathematized. They are accursed. They are actually removed, excommunicated from the church for believing that. And the reason this is this is a salvation issue. This isn't just some theological opinion that's kind of interesting to speculate about. The very salvation of the people was at stake, because if you have a wrong Jesus, you might not have a right salvation. And so the bishops, as overseers, to their credit, they are concerned with the well-beings of their flocks and with the church as a whole, the health of the church, and being faithful as bishops, not only to Christ himself, but also to the apostolic teachings, to the traditions of the church, and of course to the Holy Scriptures. And so in order to be faithful and in order to protect and guard the salvation of their flocks, they actually, in their minds, are protecting things. And so by doing this, they argue that this is our creed. And those of you who are actually arguing against this, who are saying that Christ is a created being, you are endangering the salvation of your flock. Hence, you will be anathematized. You will be excommunicated and called accursed from our church. It sounds a little politically incorrect in today's mindset where it's, oh, everybody just has their own personal religion and their own personal faith, and everybody can kind of just believe what they ever want to believe. That's really not what was going on in the early church, and really was not the attitude of the church really up until about the 1600s or 1700s, after the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and also the rise of the modern era. And so really not until that era, this whole idea of, oh, I just have my own personal faith and everybody can just believe whatever they want, that is very, very new. That is very new and was certainly not the position of the early church. In fact, it was what you believe very, very much had an impact on whether or not you were saved or not. Your salvation was dependent on what you believe. And also, of course, in the case of persecutions, it was also a way of deciding whether or not you were faithful or not. So when you said the word credo in Latin, which means I believe, credo, right? That's how the creed starts. So those of you who are familiar with music in particular, you see those credos in all those masses or requiems and that sort of thing. Credo simply just means I believe. And so when they would say I believe, their personal reputation was at stake. In many cases, their lives were at stake when they were being persecuted. And so this creedal aspect, as you remember a few episodes ago with the Gnostics, was a way of defending the faith against those who were trying to undermine the gospel. And so after Constantine proposes homoousios, there are a few who object to it because there's some philosophical connotations. I'm not going to get into all of those because that would require some Greek philosophy 101 here. But there were some connotations of this idea of a substance and what a substance is. And then other people object to it simply because the word homoousios doesn't appear in Scripture. It doesn't, but neither do other words like Trinity and some others. But we use those terms to summarize what the Scriptures have always taught. And this is another example of that. And so because those who were teaching this were undermining those, the salvation of their flock, they're actually removed from their post and exiled. And this is, of course, where Constantine gets involved and says, for the good of our realm, now that the church has spoken, I'm going to, as the emperor of the earthly kingdom, I'm going to use the doctrine of the two kingdoms or the two cities. We're going to follow Augustine here and maybe a little Luther. And there's a pope somewhere in the medieval era that also argues for this. But the idea that there's a kingdom of God and a kingdom of men. One is the eternal city or the temporal city. So Constantine, as the leader of the temporal, as the leader of the earthly city or the earthly kingdom, in order for the good of the realm, is going to actually exile these bishops. So at the end, when they have the vote, only 2 of the 318, some diehards from Libya, I believe is where they're from, only 2 of the 318 refuse to sign the creed. Only 2. Now, of course, there are some arguments of whether or not somebody might have signed because they were under pressure, because of peer pressure, or the Emperor Constantine, whatever. But again, that's a minimal amount. The vast majority is the point here. 318 to 2 sign the original Nicene Creed. Now, this could be called kind of a Nicene Creed 1.0, because the version that we all say today is actually 2.0, because there's a second council we're going to talk about in today's episode that actually revises this creed, because there's some other heresies that end up being dealt with in the church. Now, after this creed is signed by these bishops, it's sent out to all the different places in the empire. And so the creed shows up at the local churches in Spain, in France, in England, in Persia, in Italy, wherever it may be. And as this creed is sent to all these other places, it's approved. This idea of lay consent, the local church bodies also approving the creed, is important, because there's often conspiracy theories that, oh, Constantine and the imperial people after him, like Theodosius and others, they imposed imperial Christianity, and true Christianity disappeared for 1,000 years until the Reformation. Well, if that's true, you have a problem with your Christ, who said that I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Did the gates of hell prevail against his church for over 1,000 years? The answer would be no, if you have the right Christ anyways. Some groups in today's modern world think it disappeared for even longer. But the Christ of the Gospels, the Christ of Christianity, builds his church, and the gates of hell do not prevail. The church has always existed. It never disappeared. And because of this, to somehow argue that the imperial authorities imposed some sort of paganism on the church and that Christianity disappeared is simply a misreading of history and is really usually hidden as anti-established church polemics. What it really is it's a tool to try to say, oh, we've got the real hidden truth. The real truth was gone for a while and it disappeared, and now we have the secret truth. It's almost like the Gnostics in a sense. So it takes up until the 1800s or the 1900s or who knows when in order to restore the church. If you are believing that the church needed to be restored, then Christ lied. When Christ said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, if you have to restore the church, then Christ lied. Now, if you want to reform the church, that's something totally different. That's the idea that we need to clean things up, that there's been abuses or some things that have gotten in the way. Reforming has always been a tradition in the church that goes way back. Not even the Reformation. Before the Reformation, there were reforming movements, people like Bernard of Clairvaux. And so the imperial idea here is more of the temporal city, but it's not theological inherently. And the other thing to think about this is sometimes you can be right. Just because something's imperial doesn't mean it's inherently wrong, right? Just because that Constantine's involved doesn't automatically mean that something is wrong. For some reason, there's this inherent suspicion. I don't know if it's very tied into the American psyche where we distrust authorities or whatever it is, but anytime there's something imperial involved, oh, it automatically is wrong. Or it's automatically, Roman Catholic and we don't want to be Catholic or something like that. I really don't understand it some of the time, but these polemical ideas that anything that involves the imperial system is automatically wrong, I really don't understand it, and it really is just a misreading and a misinterpretation of history. Regardless, Constantine sends this stuff out, he exiles the other bishops, and the different people actually get this creed. And as they look at this creed, they say, this is the faith. We have lay consent. So since we have lay consent, not only have the leaders of the church confirmed it, but the individual believers, the local congregations have confirmed this is the faith. So Rome, Milan, and even bishops that weren't present affirm that this is the faith of Christianity. Now, you would think, hopefully, that this would completely remove the controversy, that this would end this, that we would have no problems after this, and that things would be good. Unfortunately, that is not the case. In fact, what ends up happening is Arius, rather than accepting discipline and being humbled, and his friend Eusebius, they instead go on what you could maybe call a propaganda war or a guerrilla war against the Orthodox Nicene faith. And so as you can look on your screen here, you can see a couple of pictures. The first is an icon of the Council of Nicaea. The second picture is actually a picture of Michelangelo's on the Sistine Chapel in Rome. The famous Sistine Chapel actually has several pictures of the Nicene of the different councils. And this one, you can, if you look really, really closely, you can see in the Latin the Concilium Nicaeum, the idea of the Nicene Creed. You can barely make that out on the top of the picture. Now, of course, they're wearing bishops' hats that are more medieval, like any other artwork. You know, there's some influences from the current era. But the point is that it's being depicted here at the Sistine Chapel, which is kind of neat. So you can see it on your screen there. So what happens after the council? Well, one of the ways to actually view this is to actually follow the life of the great Athanasius. And he is called Athanasius the Great in many traditions. And since Athanasius, as the secretary and the heir apparent to the elderly bishop of Alexandria, or the patriarch, Alexander of Alexandria, Athanasius is eventually going to take over. So what ends up happening is in 327, Alexander of Alexandria dies. His successor is Athanasius. But as soon as Alexander dies, he's kind of the veritable bishop. He's the one that everybody respects, kind of an ancient institution. And even the Arians, like Eusebius and Arius himself, don't really want to mess with him too much because he's so well respected. And he's one of the big winners in the Council of Nicaea, and rightfully so. But after he dies in 327, Eusebius starts to lobby the emperor. Eusebius of Nicomedia is actually a family member. He's related distantly to Emperor Constantine. And since he's related distantly, he has an influence on the emperor. And what he does to the emperor and how he influences the emperor should also help those of you who think Constantine somehow dictated what Christianity is. Constantine ends up dying very, very confused. In fact, he ends up arguing for the wrong side. So here Constantine comes in initially and says, I'm going to honor what the bishops say, and I'm going to promote this and exile those who disagree on this just because for the good of my realm. But what he ends up doing is actually taking the guys that he originally disagreed with back and starts exiling the Orthodox Christians. So to somehow argue Constantine is creating the imperial faith, his actions would basically argue otherwise. And so Eusebius of Nicomedia influences Constantine, and then eventually they're called back. Eusebius of Nicomedia is trying to restore people that were arguing against the Christian faith. He's trying to restore them to their pastoral positions, to their bishoprics. And when this starts happening, Athanasius, because he's the leader of the Church of Alexandria, and because there were other followers of Arius in his diocese, if you want to use the term diocese, because there were other followers, he is ordered to allow those people back in without a question. And Athanasius says, no. You, O emperor, are not the ruler of this church. Christ is the ruler of this church. You are not a bishop. I am a bishop. You, Eusebius of Nicomedia, are past your jurisdiction, and you're a heretic anyways. And so I am going to be faithful, and I refuse to admit back into communion those who are imperiling the salvation of my flock. He is making a stand. In spite of the fact that all this pressure is going on, in spite of the fact that he may face some consequences, and he does face consequences more than once in his life, but Athanasius makes a stand saying, I will defend the faith, and I will not allow these sort of people into my church. It's a really kind of an inspiring stand by Athanasius. And so he is actually technically bishop for 45 years. And I use the word technically on purpose because as a defender of the faith, he ends up spending a vast majority of those years in exile. And so because he's in conflict with the imperial authorities and because Constantine is frustrated that there's not unity, he starts to target Athanasius as the source of all the problems. And so after he starts restoring Arians, Athanasius is accused by his enemies of bad behavior. Everything from interfering with grain transports from the Nile to Constantinople, which of course was a big deal back then because this was a way of feeding the army and keeping the populace happy. So he's interfering with grain transports. He had somebody killed. He maimed somebody else. I mean, all these just random accusations to try to undermine Athanasius. And dramatically, at one of the trials they had, Athanasius actually brings the guy in he supposedly had his hands cut off and says, look, his hands are still there, and undermines the charges. He is never guilty of any of these charges, but they keep trumping these up to try to get rid of Athanasius because he's creating a problem for the Arians and for Constantine. At another instance, he actually shows up in Constantinople and confronts the emperor in the street, which is pretty daring. But he literally gets in front of the emperor's horse, the emperor's chariot, or whatever it is he's riding in, gets in front of the emperor and says, hear my case, and the emperor pardons Athanasius. This is where, again, Constantine's really inconsistent at this point. It's tough to know whose side he's on. In reality, he's really not on anybody's side as much as he's still trying to argue for unity. And since Nicaea didn't work, and because he's a very practical, pragmatic man, he favors the other side to try to get unity and really dies confused on the Nicene issue. Even though he himself, through his theological advisor, proposed the solution, the term homoousia, one substance. He provides the solution, but then he dies, and when he dies, he's actually baptized by an Arian bishop, Eusebius of Nicomedia. He's actually baptized by a heretic. But because it's in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, it's still considered a valid baptism. So Constantine's still called Saint Constantine or Constantine the Great because of all he did for the church, but it's not because of his theological acumen. It's not because he's rigorous in his theology or that he wasn't confused. It's more of what he did for the church temporally or how he actually called the Council of Nicaea, because he did call that council the Great Ecumenical Council. And so Athanasius, and this is just kind of funny, Athanasius would actually be exiled 5 times, at least 5 times, or 17 years of his pastoral rule or his bishopric rule. So he spent 17 full years of his life in exile in a variety of different places. In some cases, he's up in Trier, which is now modern-day Germany, that area, or Austria. So you can kind of visualize that in Europe. He's into Central Europe. Another time, and remember, he's natively Egyptian, so that's a pretty good exile. He's getting to the completely other end of the realm. But he's also even spending time for a couple of weeks in his father's tomb. That had to have been a little interesting. You're hiding in exile, and so you go hide in your father's tomb for 2 weeks. He actually spends time, because he's in exile so much, amongst the desert fathers, the desert monks of the time, We're going to get into monasticism in the next couple of episodes, and we'll talk about Athanasius again because he's going to show up again in our narrative when we talk about the Desert Fathers and those trying to live that authentic Christian life, that life of contemplative prayer, that life of denying the flesh in the desert. So he goes and lives with them and communicates with them, and the great founder of the desert monasticism, St. Anthony, finds Athanasius to be without fault, and he's a great ally. So Athanasius is exiled 5 times, spends a few weeks in his father's tomb, and he really just is living out the faith. He is not afraid of exile. You can imagine, by the time he gets to about the 3rd or 4th exile, he's probably like, all right, I've got my suitcase packed already anyways, right? I mean, I know it's going to happen again, whether it's from Constantine or his kids' kids, chances are I'm going to be exiled again. So it's kind of a funny thing. And he actually lives a very long time, into the 360s, 370s, never sees the full victory. We're going to talk about that in a second, the full victory of the Nicene faith. But he's very faithful, and he becomes a hero for the church. So Athanasius is on basically everybody's calendar. Even some Protestant churches call him the father of the canon because, as you may remember from last episode, in 367 AD, he writes a festal letter, which is an Easter letter that he sends to all the people under his jurisdiction. He actually writes a letter, and he lists all 27 books of the New Testament as accepted scripture, which is why he's called the father of the canon. But he's also called St. Athanasius, Athanasius the Great, and there are a variety of good reasons for that, namely his defense of the Orthodox faith. Some other things about Athanasius, just as an aside, now we'll have a future episode that'll be completely devoted to Athanasius, but for those of you who are interested in him, his most famous work is called On the Incarnation of the Word. In other words, on the incarnation, on the taking on of flesh of the Son of God, of Jesus Christ. He also has a series of writings called Against the Arians, surprise, surprise, and a few other, as we mentioned, the festal letters, a few other letters and other minor works. Now, even though he was restored in his late age, he dies and never sees the final victory in 381. He actually is honored in the Western calendar on May 2nd. So those of you who are Christians and you want to honor Athanasius or read some of his writings, May 2nd, which is coming up here in about 6 weeks, we're filming here in March, Athanasius is honored on May 2nd. For those of you, at least in the West he is. In the East, his date is a little different. You can actually get his book on the Incarnation with a famous introduction now by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, of course, is famous for the Chronicles of Narnia and the book Mere Christianity. If you don't read C.S. Lewis, highly recommend reading him because he's enormously influential on Christians today. But he actually has a book, rather an introduction, a small little essay that's actually attached to On the Incarnation by St. Athanasius. It's an introduction because C.S. Lewis found the book highly inspiring. A more modern take on Athanasius can actually be found by Peter J. Leithart, who actually teaches in Moscow, Idaho, at the University of St. Andrews. So in Moscow, Idaho, Leithart has a new book that's a study on Athanasius. Just came out in the last couple of years. I personally have it. Highly recommend it. And you can see the cover of it on your screen there. It's actually the first book in a series that are coming out on some of these church fathers that are universally admired across the different traditions of the faith. So what happens? Well, after Athanasius dies, and the controversy keeps coming and going and ebbing and flowing, and different emperors take different sides depending on if they're in the West or the East. And of course, the Bishop of Rome is actually on the right side almost the entire time, the Bishop of Rome, which is important. One of the reasons the Pope becomes so prestigious is because the church in Rome is on the right side of a lot of these issues. Almost always. They are a defender of the faith, especially for the first few hundred years, which is one of the reasons it becomes so prestigious. So what happens? Well, a guy named Theodosius the Great, you're going to hear these greats, right? But Theodosius the Great ends up taking control, and he is Nicene Orthodox. And this is in the late 370s. Theodosius the Great takes control, and by 381 calls another ecumenical council to solve this Arian problem once and for all. And so this council, recognized by all Orthodox Christians everywhere, gives us the version of the creed that we say today. So those of you who like text speak, this is the Nicene Creed 2.0 that we say today. So I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ. You guys may recognize that. That Nicene Creed, by the way, you should all read the Nicene Creed. Even if you're not a Christian, you should read it because it is the definition of what Orthodox Christians believe anywhere. You want to know what Christians believe? Read the ecumenical creeds, especially the Nicene Creed. But I digress a little bit here. In addition to Arianism, there were a couple of other heresies that had popped up in the church, mostly with good intentions, but they had created other problems. One heresy was known as Macedonianism, which is kind of a fancy word for denying the divinity of the Holy Spirit. The original 1.0 version of the Nicene Creed doesn't really flesh out the Holy Spirit very much. This second version does, because this heresy arose in the church. And basically, Macedonians denied that the Holy Spirit was fully divine. They thought he was just kind of this amorphous force, or the breath of God, or something like that, but not actually a being that had personality. And because of this, they would actually deny his divinity. They denied the divinity of the Spirit, and that was a problem in the church. So that was something they needed to address in addition to Arianism at the council. Another controversy that needed to be solved was something called Apollinarism. This is the idea that Christ has a divine mind and a human body, but not the full natures of both. This is actually a hint of some later controversies. The 3rd through 6th councils all have to do with Christology, the idea of who Christ is. So if Christ has a divine mind and a human body, but not a full human nature, say he doesn't have a human mind, the Cappadocian fathers, who we're going to meet here, would argue what has not been assumed has not been redeemed. So if Christ didn't have a fully human mind, he didn't redeem our human minds. If Christ does not have a full human will, he did not redeem our fallen human will. What has not been assumed has not been redeemed. He has to be fully God and fully man, perfect to the properties of each, as it will say in the 4th council. But even here in the 2nd council, there's hints of this in Apollinarism, because if he only has a divine mind and just a human body, the human body is just kind of a shell. It's just kind of like a costume or a suit that he puts on, and he's actually not redeeming or taking on our nature. He's just kind of using that with his divine nature inside of it. So this was another heresy that the church had to deal with when it came to the 2nd council. Now, this council actually accepts and revises the Nicene Creed and gives us the version that we say today. So they flesh out what we had talked about before with the idea that he's light of light, true God of true God, very God of very God. It actually fleshes that out and adds the section on the Holy Spirit. The Bishop of Constantinople in this council is also raised to the same rank as Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. Now this creates some contention in the church, because Rome always tried to say, look, we're kind of the first among equals here, or we have a certain prestige here because we're the largest city. And Jerusalem is also raised up, which is interesting, just because it's the place where Christ lived and died and walked, and also the place, of course, where the first church was. The first church was the Jerusalem church, so its rank is raised, and we have what is now known as the Pentarchy, the group of 5, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Jerusalem. Now, Constantinople's put in 2nd place, so that wasn't necessarily in order, but the idea is these are patriarchates. These are kind of senior bishops, or metropolitan bishops even, or even greater than that. They have a certain prestige that they could hear disputes and solve things. As we already know from Alexandria, that was already the case when it came to the Arian controversy, and Alexander calling a synod and having everybody show up. And so at this council, a lot of famous figures are involved. The most famous that's actually at the council itself is Gregory the Theologian. Gregory the Theologian. He's very, very famous in the East in particular. In the West, we also know him as Gregory Nazianzus, but he is one of the great defenders of the Orthodox faith. He actually went to Constantinople earlier when there was an Arian emperor and started a house church to defend the faith. So Gregory the Theologian originally actually presides over the Council of Constantinople, but because he can't stand the bickering and all the politics, actually recuses himself for a variety of different reasons. But other figures that are associated during this era, even if they weren't at the council, include famous figures like Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, Hilary of Poitiers, and there are many, many, many others. Ambrose, of course, is from Milan, and he's not at the council, but a great defender of the faith. Gregory of Nyssa is another famous figure you'll often hear, Basil the Great, also from this area. Actually, Basil the Great is a good friend to Gregory the Theologian, and actually is a brother to Gregory of Nyssa. So we have Basil and Gregory. They're actually brothers. So you can see all these kind of interconnected networks in the early church. Now, this council and all of these figures are on the calendars of basically every church everywhere, which is another reason you need to know these guys. So again, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Lutherans, Anglicans, doesn't matter. These guys are on their calendars as heroes, as saints, so to speak, of the faith, people we're studying and emulating when it comes to Christianity. So this Nicene Creed then, this Nicene Creed that came from the Second Council, the 2.0 version, is the living, breathing, historic faith of the church. If you are not confessing the truths in this creed, you're outside the faith. And I know that sounds rather harsh, but you simply are. Because the universal church, since 381, and in a sense since 325, and even before then, because this is based on summarizing what the scriptures have always taught, this is the Christian faith. So if you aren't confessing it, you are outside of it. And since this was dearly bought, this was the blood of the martyrs was shed for this creed. The great Athanasius spent time in his dad's tomb for this creed. And this is just one guy. There are numerous stories of this, people being killed, people going through great persecutions to actually give us this faith. And so if you are not holding to this, you are outside of the Christian faith. Do not let somebody tell you that this is some sort of imperial edict that breaks things down, that just pounds things down. That's not what's going on here. This is a living, breathing, historic faith that was faithfully confessed by the church since the very beginning, and it had to react, of course, to different heresies in the church, but it's still in the church to this day, and it's still confessed by faithful Christians everywhere. Every Sunday, this Nicene Creed will be said across the different traditions of Christendom. Every Sunday. Now, not every Sunday in every individual church. Some churches do it every other week or whatever. The point being is that it is a foundational summary statement of the Christian faith. The Nicene Constantinopolitan, that's the technical term for the theologians and historians here, but we can just call it the Nicene Creed 2.0. That creed is the faith, the living Christian faith. You can see on your screen, actually, we're actually going to go through all 7 ecumenical councils of the church. We actually just talked about the first 2. Now, there's more to talk about in the second one, but for the sake of time, I'm actually kind of burning through that one. I spent more time on the first one just because it's such a momentous event, but the second one is almost equally important, and the first 4 in particular, Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon, or Chalcedon, depending on how anglicized you are the most important. And then the next 3 are also important, but they're kind of like a 1B as to the first 4 is 1A. So Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon are the first 4 ecumenical councils. And we're going to talk about all 7. The 5th and 6th councils actually help clean up and explain what happened in the first 4. So they're necessary, and they're sort of an extension of the previous councils on the nature of Christ, for instance. The 7th, the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 is kind of our bookend. That's where we're ending our study of Martyrs, Kings, and Fathers. The 7th Council is rather unique because it has to do with icons and art in church and idolatry and the controversies involved with that. So it's a rather unique look. However, it still has to do with Christology in a sense because it has to do with the incarnation and how Christ actually took on matter to redeem matter. Okay, so the 7th Council isn't unimportant, it's just rather unique. And in some ways, in the Western Church, it's not as emphasized. If you talk to a Lutheran or an Anglican about the 7th Council, a lot of them actually really don't know much about it. They might know that it says that, art is good or something, but they really don't know much about it. But the first 4 are held to without question. In fact, there was a theological consultation just in the last couple of years between the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and the Anglican Church in North America, and one of the things they both agreed on, without question, was that they accepted the first 4 ecumenical councils and the 3 ecumenical creeds, and the second of those creeds is that Nicene Creed. So one of the first points of contact where there's absolute agreement among Christians is on those councils and creeds, and so it was kind of interesting to see that the faithful Lutherans and the faithful Anglicans got together and said, you know what? We may not agree on every single point of issue, but on this one, on the creeds and the councils, we are in absolute agreement that we hold to these first 4 and these first 3 creeds without any questions, without any reservations whatsoever. Again, the notes for this session will be available on the website at hayesworldview.wordpress.com. You'll actually see a tab at the top of the website that will say Martyrs, Kings, and Fathers. So if you want the PowerPoint in PDF form, if you want maybe some outlines that are available, go ahead and go to that site. You can even leave comments on that page, that Martyrs, Kings, and Fathers page, and I can respond to any questions you may have. You may also email me, of course, like always, at martyrskingsandfathers@gmail.com. I do my best to respond to inquiries as fast as I can. I have had a couple of you out there ask some interesting questions. One question I had was about the rise of Islam, which will actually address later on. That'll be a full episode, the rise of Islam and how it contributes to the split between the East and the West. It's a rather interesting split that takes place. And so next episode, we're going to actually look at the division between East and West, as I just kind of briefly alluded to, because you start to see just barely some roots start to take place between the East and the West. And some of it's just language, Latin, Greek, that sort of thing. And we're also going to look at the rise of monasticism. This is a really, really interesting period in the church. And the hint for you guys out there of why all of a sudden a bunch of people just flee to the desert has to do with popularity and doing what the world thinks is good. So, if your emperor, in this case Constantine, or later on Theodosius, decides to favor Christianity, and you have people in the cities in particular who become Christians just for the sake of political convenience, it's a bit of a turnoff for the faith. So a lot of them actually leave the cities, and in order to live a more authentic life, in order to be living witnesses, living, breathing martyrs, so to speak, for the church, they actually flee to the desert to devote themselves to prayer and to helping the poor and to living the contemplative life and to denying the flesh and to conquer evil in their lives and a variety of other things. They actually leave for the desert. So we'll talk about that at our next episode. So again, know these first two councils, know all seven, but especially the first four, if you want to know what Christians have always believed. And if you are a Christian, or if you're interested in the Christian faith, you need to profess these early councils and creeds because they do summarize the living, breathing, historic faith of the church. Thank you again for joining us here at Martyr Kings and Fathers, and I look forward to seeing you next week as we continue to study the history of the early church. Thank you.